effect is going to be positive. What we're hoping for is to increase the structural diversity, so through, again, the unique behavior of the bison.
Began trying to fix that, not with a new national park, but rather a huge, privately operated nature reserve.
In 2007, 6 European bison were transported to a section of the Dutch coastline that scientists had essentially dismissed as ecologically dead. Most experts agreed on one prediction:
for conservation purposes. So this is really groundbreaking stuff, and it means we can contribute scientific understanding of rewilding.
But the animals would never survive even one winter there. That prediction proved wrong. 18 years later, the landscape has changed so dramatically that photographs taken before and after hardly appear to show the same location. Yet almost nobody beyond a small circle of Dutch researchers understands exactly how the transformation occurred. 6 animals, 1 enclosed reserve, a landscape that nearly everyone had abandoned. What those bison actually did to the dunes is more unusual and far better documented than it may initially seem. The claim? The story often told about Kraansvlak, an enclosed dune reserve on the Dutch coast between Haarlem and Zandvoort, can sound almost too perfectly arranged to be credible. In its simplest form, the claim is this: a small group of bison was introduced into a deteriorating ecosystem and restored it. Animals traditionally described in textbooks as inhabitants of dense forests supposedly flourished on an exposed coastline, reopened a disappearing habitat, and may even have helped protect the drinking water supply used by more than 1 million people. Despite the fact that water protection had never been part of the original experiment. That is an extraordinary amount of responsibility to assign to 6 animals, so the story deserves careful examination rather than immediate celebration. What makes this case particularly useful is that nearly every major element can be verified. There are dated release records, herd population figures, mapped field observations, an 8-year vegetation study published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and a regional water company that publicly explains how the dune system operates.
All of this together, when you mirror that up with the tracking data of the bison, really starts to shape our understanding of how the bison are interacting with their surroundings and the impacts that they're having.
The real question, therefore, is not whether the story is emotionally inspiring. The question is how much of it is genuinely supported by evidence. To answer that properly, 3 issues must be established in sequence. First, what condition were the dunes truly in before the bison arrived? The claim only matters if the ecosystem was actually deteriorating. Second, why did anyone believe bison might solve the problem when conventional scientific thinking classified them as forest animals? Third, what measurable changes occurred after their introduction, and which conclusions remain uncertain? Before continuing, a brief note for viewers who value investigations of this kind. Each week, this channel examines one major claim, separating what survives scrutiny from what does not. With that said, the proper place to begin is the landscape itself, because the entire case depends on the state of the dunes before the first bison ever stepped onto them. A landscape closing in? By 2007, Kraansvlak had been losing its gray dune habitat for approximately 20 years. To understand the seriousness of that decline, it is necessary to explain what a gray dune actually is, since the term is unfamiliar to most people outside ecology and conservation. Beyond the foredunes, the bright shifting ridges of sand closest to the sea, lies an older and more stable dune system. Instead of loose sand or dense grass, its surface is covered with a low layer of lichens and mosses. This creates a muted gray-green appearance, which gives the habitat its name. Gray dunes are among the richest ecosystems for biodiversity in northern Europe. They depend on nutrient-poor, sandy soil and scattered areas of uncovered ground. These conditions support a wide range of highly specialized plants, insects, and reptiles that occur in very few other habitats. The European Union recognizes gray dunes as a priority habitat under the Natura 2000 network, a formal classification reserved for ecosystems that European countries have committed themselves to conserving. At Kraansvlak, however, that habitat was steadily vanishing. The evidence indicates that 2 major forces were acting together. The first was nitrogen deposition. For years, nitrogen produced by Dutch agriculture and road traffic had been settling over the dunes. Nitrogen functions as fertilizer, but gray dunes are ecosystems specifically adapted to the opposite condition. extreme nutrient poverty. As nutrient concentrations increase, the exposed, infertile sand required by specialist species becomes rich enough to sustain thick grass. That grass then overwhelms the lichen and moss layer and spreads across the open patches. In practical terms, the ecosystem was being fertilized into a condition it had never evolved to withstand. The second pressure was the collapse of the rabbit population. For centuries, rabbits had acted as the dune system's natural groundskeepers. By feeding in large numbers, they kept grass short and continually disturbed the soil, exposing fresh sand. Then disease devastated them. Myxomatosis swept through rabbit populations during the 1950s. Rabbit hemorrhagic disease appeared during the 1980s and struck again around 2015. By the end of the 1990s, the number of rabbits in the Dutch dunes had declined by more than 90%. Once the rabbits disappeared, almost nothing remained to prevent grass and shrubs from taking over. The combined outcome was predictable. Without animals consuming the vegetation, woody species began spreading, including sea buckthorn and invasive American cherry. Conservation workers would spend the following 2 decades attempting to control these plants by cutting them back. As the vegetation became denser, the specific landscape features required by rare species began to disappear. Open sandy patches used by sand lizards for laying eggs were being covered. The loose soil needed by sand wasps for their burrows was vanishing. Areas where the seaside pansy could germinate were being buried beneath an increasingly thick green layer. The dunes were not being destroyed by one spectacular disaster. Instead, they were slowly sealing themselves shut. It is important to pause here and consider why bare sand is so valuable, because this contradicts ordinary intuition. Most people naturally assume that more vegetation means a healthier ecosystem. A green, densely covered dune may appear healthier than a sparse, partially exposed one. For gray dunes, the reverse is true. Their ecological importance comes precisely from their instability. Shifting sand, exposed soil, and a varied mosaic of small habitats that never become completely fixed. The pioneer plants, reptiles, and specialized insects living in these systems evolved alongside repeated disturbance. They depend on it rather than suffering from it. When disturbance disappears and the surface becomes stable, rare specialists lose the environmental conditions they need. They are gradually replaced by common species capable of growing almost anywhere. The closure of Kraansvlak, therefore, represented more than a reduction in open space. It marked a transition toward a more ordinary and less biologically diverse environment, the kind of landscape already widespread across Europe. The timescale is also important. This deterioration did not occur suddenly, which made it particularly difficult to stop. Gray dunes may decline gradually over many years or even decades. One season can look almost identical to the previous one, even while the overall trend continues downward. By the time the damage becomes obvious, a considerable amount of land may already have changed from open habitat to closed vegetation. That slow progression helps explain why conventional management, sending teams to remove shrubs, could not keep pace. The vegetation grew back more quickly than workers could clear it, and cutting alone did not recreate the constant physical disruption the ecosystem required. The grazing problem. The organization observing this deterioration was not primarily a wildlife charity. It was a water company. PWN, the provincial water utility, owns approximately 7,300 hectares of the coastal dunes. Before bison were considered, the company had already attempted to slow the habitat's decline through grazing. PWN introduced Konik horses and Highland cattle into sections of the reserve, based on the reasonable idea that large grazing animals would suppress excessive plant growth. The animals did influence the landscape. The horses consumed grass, while the cattle browsed young trees and shrubs. However, the results demonstrated that grazing of this kind was insufficient to reverse the broader ecological trend. The explanation lies in what horses and cattle do, and what they do not do. Both species removed vegetation from above, but neither caused substantial disturbance to the soil. They did not regularly break the surface, uncover new sand, or physically reshape the terrain. They reduced one visible symptom, overgrowth, without restoring the deeper environmental condition the gray dunes needed. Open, broken, continuously changing ground. In some locations, the rate of deterioration slowed, but the decline continued. A crucial ecological function was still absent. and one project coordinator believes she had identified what it was. A disputed theory? Yvonne Kemp, a project coordinator working with the conservation organization ARC Nature and with PWN, had spent years promoting an idea that many colleagues regarded as improbable. She argued that the European bison had been seriously misunderstood and that its conventional description as a forest animal was based on incomplete information. The established interpretation appears straightforward and is supported by direct observation. Almost everything historically known about free-living European bison came from Białowieża forest, which straddles the border between Poland and Belarus. This was the species' final refuge after centuries of hunting had driven it close to extinction throughout the rest of Europe. In Białowieża, bison live among dense woodland, shelter beneath trees, and receive hay from rangers during winter. Anyone observing them there could understandably conclude that they are naturally forest-dwelling animals. Kemp believed that conclusion reversed cause and effect. Her argument, shared by several rewilding researchers but still not accepted as settled science, is that bison may not have selected forests as their preferred habitat. Instead, they may have been forced into them. Over thousands of years, persistent human hunting could have driven the surviving animals toward areas where hunters had greater difficulty following them: deep forests. By the time scientists began studying European bison systematically, the only remaining population was living in this last protected refuge. That population might therefore reveal more about the places where humans permitted bison to survive than about the habitats to which the species is biologically best adapted. Under this interpretation, European bison historically occupied a broad range of open and semi-open landscapes, including grasslands, river valleys, and coastal plains. Precision is essential here because part of this argument is factual and part remains interpretive. It is a fact that European bison survived into modern times mainly in forests. The conclusion that they are therefore a forest-adapted species is an interpretation, and one that remains disputed. Kemp's historical explanation is a hypothesis rather than a proven fact. Researchers can reasonably disagree about how broadly it applies. The Kraansvlak experiment offered an unusual opportunity to test at least one part of the theory directly. If European bison were biologically restricted to forests, a herd living on open Dutch dunes should struggle and should behave similarly to forest animals dependent on supplemental feeding. If Kemp's argument was closer to reality, bison placed in open terrain might survive and behave in a completely different way. The only reliable method was to conduct a controlled trial and measure the outcome. The experiment. The cautious structure of the project reveals how seriously the organizers regarded the risk, although much of their concern focused not on the bison themselves, but on the people observing the experiment. The Netherlands is among the most densely populated countries in Europe. It has little remote wilderness where a failed conservation trial could unfold unnoticed. Kraansvlak lies only about 5 kilometers from central Haarlem. It is surrounded by a densely inhabited environment filled with roads, residents, and frequent visitors. Any failure would be highly visible. The implications also extended beyond this particular reserve. Across Europe, conservationists were slowly attempting to reintroduce large grazing animals into ecosystems from which they had disappeared. Many of those projects were politically vulnerable. Had European bison starved on the Dutch coast because conservationists appeared to disregard expert advice, the resulting loss of public confidence could have harmed rewilding programs well beyond the Netherlands. Beginning with only a few animals reduced that risk. The project therefore moved forward in carefully controlled stages. The team selected animals originating from the Białowieża population, the same population on which the conventional scientific description of the species was based. An initial enclosure of 220 hectares was established. On April 24, 2007, 3 bison, 1 male and 2 females, were released. They were the first free-ranging bison on Dutch soil since Roman times. 11 months later, in March 2008, another 3 animals from the same forest arrived, increasing the herd to 6. Most importantly, the researchers made one decision on which the entire experiment depended. The bison would receive no winter food. If the species could survive only in forests with supplemental feeding, the lack of hay would expose that limitation quickly. If the conventional assumption was wrong, the animals would have to demonstrate it by feeding themselves. The team then waited, observed, and documented the results. The staged introduction, 3 animals first, followed by 3 more almost a year later, also served as a practical safeguard. It allowed researchers to assess how the first group adapted before introducing the complete herd. It also ensured that the project remained small enough to reverse if serious problems emerged. This was not simply caution about the animals, it was discipline regarding the precedent the experiment might set. A small group could be watched intensively, and a small-scale failure could be contained. A larger herd experiencing distress would have been more difficult to manage and far more damaging to public confidence. It is equally important to clarify what the project was not attempting. The animals were not being released into unrestricted countryside, which would have been politically unrealistic in such a densely populated nation. They lived inside a fenced reserve under close observation. Their available territory expanded only when the results justified doing so. This distinction matters when evaluating the claims because the ecological outcome was produced in a monitored and measurable setting, not under uncontrolled circumstances where cause and effect would be difficult to separate. The first winters. The first winter arrived from the North Sea and produced the experiment's earliest decisive finding. The bison did not need hay. Records show that the animals dug for roots, removed bark from creeping willow and young oak trees, rolled in the sand, and sustained themselves entirely on resources available in the open dune environment. All 6 survived. The second winter produced the same result. Once again, the herd endured the season without receiving supplementary food. This is the first conclusion that can be described as established rather than interpreted. According to project records, this was the first documented European bison population to survive in an exposed coastal ecosystem without supplemental feeding. That is a specific and verifiable result, and it directly contradicted predictions that the animals would be unable to tolerate the terrain. A species widely categorized by prevailing science as a deep forest animal had survived 2 winters beside the North Sea by feeding entirely within an open Dutch dune system. Some members of the established bison research community reacted with skepticism. Kemp later described the dismissive response she encountered at the time with the phrase, "Bison in the dunes, the crazy Dutch." Considering the accepted scientific view, such skepticism was understandable. Nevertheless, the survival evidence remained. Survival, however, was only the initial result. By itself, it would have been interesting, but relatively limited. The more important discoveries concerned the changes occurring in the landscape around the animals. At this point, the investigation shifts from asking whether the bison survived to asking whether they produced measurable ecological effects. The wallows. The best studied mechanism begins with the immense size of the animals. An adult European bison typically weighs between approximately 600 and 900 kilograms. This makes it around 5 times heavier than the other grazing species present in the Dutch dunes. That mass enables bison to affect the ground in ways smaller animals cannot. During summer, a bison may lower itself and roll on the ground several times each day. This behavior, called wallowing, has practical purposes. It helps clean the coat, remove parasites, and regulate body temperature. All bison wallow. But when an animal weighing hundreds of kilograms repeatedly rolls and twists in one location, it scrapes away vegetation and creates a shallow depression filled with loose, uncovered sand. Such a pit can measure approximately 2 meters across. Every wallow becomes a small break in the surrounding vegetation. Researchers at Kraansvlak found that the herd wallowed particularly frequently during the first 8 years of the project. Scientists from the University of Groningen, Utrecht University, and associated institutions mapped these depressions and recorded thousands of them throughout the bison enclosure. Their importance is straightforward. The central ecological problem in the dunes was the disappearance of bare ground. Through completely ordinary behavior, the bison continually created exactly that missing feature. Species that depend on exposed sand began using the wallows. Sand lizards deposited their eggs in the warm, loose soil. Sand wasps constructed nests around the edges. The seaside pansy, a small plant that requires bare ground for germination, began appearing in locations where it had not been documented for decades. It would be excessive to argue that the bison alone caused every biological recovery, because dune ecosystems are influenced by many interconnected processes. A more accurate description is that researchers observed associations strongly consistent with the proposed mechanism. The pattern was unmistakable and matched the prediction. When open soil returned, specialist species requiring that soil also returned. This is one of the strongest sections of the evidence because the chain of events was directly observed. Researchers saw the bison wallowing. They measured and mapped the resulting pits. They then recorded species using those newly exposed areas. The conclusion did not depend solely on speculation. Bark and dead wood. The bison also altered the woody vegetation, and once again the process was visible and physically measurable. Several of the plants overtaking the dunes, including creeping willow, hawthorn, and invasive American cherry, became sources of food or surfaces against which the bison rubbed their bodies. American cherry was especially significant because conservation teams had spent roughly 20 years attempting to remove it with chainsaws. The bison stripped long vertical sections of bark from tree trunks. When bark is removed completely around the circumference of a trunk, the tree dies. Foresters call this process ring barking because it destroys the living tissue responsible for moving water and nutrients through the tree. In practical terms, the animals killed some of the same invasive trees that conservation workers had been targeting. However, they did so in a way that produced additional ecological value. Trees removed by chainsaw are usually cut down and carried away. Trees killed by bison often remain standing. Ecologically, standing dead timber is not useless material. It provides habitat for beetles that depend on decaying wood, along with many other organisms connected to deadwood ecosystems. This type of habitat is often removed during conventional clearance work, when felled trunks are taken off-site. As the ringbark trees died, their leaves disappeared, the shrub layer became less dense, and increasing amounts of sunlight reached the surface. That additional light benefited the low-growing pioneer vegetation characteristic of gray dunes. The useful comparison is therefore not simply between two outcomes, but between two management methods. Chainsaw crews eliminate unwanted trees, leaving stumps and piles of timber that generally require removal. Bison can eliminate similar woody growth while simultaneously creating standing deadwood habitat and allowing more light through the canopy. Both approaches reduce shrub invasion. However, bison generated ecological side effects that human crews could not easily reproduce, and the animals performed this work continuously rather than during occasional scheduled clearance campaigns. A coat filled with seeds. A third process involves plant movement across the reserve and depends on the bison's coat. European bison possess thick, oily, heavily tangled fur that enables them to withstand cold winters and exposed conditions. Studies associated with the project found that their coats could carry seeds and burrs from dozens of plant species at any given moment. As the animals moved throughout the enclosure, those seeds were transported from one section of the dunes to another and gradually released. The bison were therefore doing two things at once. They were creating open spaces in which plants could establish, and they were carrying plant material to those newly disturbed locations. The difference between bison and the other grazing animals was informative. Conic horses and highland cattle occupying the same wider park generally moved across smaller areas and transported substantially less plant material. This was partly due to their shorter coats and partly due to their more restricted movement patterns. Bison traveled farther and carried a larger seed load. Researchers described the practical effect as a reconnection of the dune landscape. The herd linked isolated areas of open ground, separate seed sources, and fragmented habitats that had previously become divided from one another. It is reasonable to describe the animals as mobile ecological connectors, gradually stitching separated portions of the ecosystem back into a functioning whole. That interpretation is supported by studies of their seed loads and movement patterns, and it is consistent with the other observed mechanisms. No single process is spectacular by itself, yet when combined, all three point in the same direction: the creation of bare ground, the suppression of invasive woody vegetation, and the movement of seeds, all resulting from one large herbivore carrying out its normal daily activities. What the evidence revealed. Observations made by rangers can be highly informative, but they are not sufficient on their own to prove a broad ecological claim. The project's organizers understood that the strongest conclusion would require comparative data. That evidence emerged in 2018. That year, Kemp and several co-authors published an 8-year vegetation study in the peer-reviewed journal Mammal Research. The study was designed to create a meaningful comparison. Inside the national park, researchers repeatedly measured fixed transects, the same narrow sections of terrain, over a long period. Those survey lines crossed 3 different management areas. One area contained European bison, together with conic horses. A second area was grazed by free-ranging cattle. A third area contained no large grazing animals and was allowed to develop without intervention. The central measurement was woody plant encroachment, the spread of trees and shrubs responsible for closing the gray dune ecosystem. The findings showed a clear progression among the 3 sites. In the area without large grazers, woody encroachment accelerated. Vegetation closed over the terrain increasingly quickly. In the cattle-grazed area, trees and shrubs continued advancing. The cattle did not significantly stop the process. The strongest decline in woody encroachment occurred in the bison area. Where bison moved and fed, the open vegetation required by gray dunes remained comparatively stable. This 8-year comparison is the most rigorous evidence associated with the entire project, and it must be described accurately. The study does not establish that bison are the only management option capable of preserving gray dunes. It also does not prove that identical results would appear at every other location, because the research examined one landscape over one specific period. What it does demonstrate is that, within this controlled comparison, the bison-grazed zone resisted habitat-closing vegetation more successfully than either the cattle-grazed zone or the area without grazers. For a project that began with a controversial hypothesis, a measured 8-year investigation published in a peer-reviewed journal provides substantial support. The herd expands. In addition to the ecological measurements, the history of the herd can be followed through basic population data. Those figures describe animals that did much more than merely remain alive. By 2018, the original group of 6 bison had produced 33 calves over a period of 10 years. As the population succeeded, the project expanded the amount of land available to it. The bison enclosure increased from 220 hectares to 280 hectares in 2012. In 2014, it expanded again to 330 hectares after PWN, and local authorities concluded that the experiment was producing positive results. By 2023, the population had been intentionally stabilized at approximately 22 animals, a number selected to keep the herd in balance with the carrying capacity of the reserve. Animals beyond that target were not treated as a burden. Instead, they became valuable for other restoration projects. Bison born at Kraansvlak had effectively demonstrated from birth that they could live in an open coastal habitat without receiving supplementary feed. That made them especially useful to conservation programs seeking animals adapted to similar circumstances. Surplus bison were transferred to initiatives in Spain, Germany, and other locations within the Netherlands. Through direct descendants, the 6 animals originally delivered in 2 vehicles became the founding source for bison populations, contributing to restoration efforts across several regions of Europe. The project also achieved a research milestone. In 2020, staff placed what they described as the first high-resolution GPS collar ever fitted to a European bison on one of the female animals. This created a new opportunity to examine how bison use different parts of the environment throughout the seasons. Such detailed movement information was unavailable from earlier forest-centered research. It now allows scientists to explore open habitat behavior with a level of accuracy that had not previously been possible. The water beneath the dunes. The final component of the claim is the most unexpected and requires the greatest caution because it depends more heavily on inference than the other findings. PWN did not originally acquire these dunes because of bison conservation. The landscape forms part of the regional drinking water system. PWN provides water to approximately 1.7 million people throughout North Holland. Around 45% of that supply passes through the coastal dunes before reaching consumers. The basic method predates the modern Dutch water distribution network. Rainwater and pre-treated river water are allowed to infiltrate the sand. The water then travels slowly through roughly 60 meters of dune material, while layers of sand and biological organisms remove contaminants. By the time the water is recovered, it is sufficiently clean that PWN does not use chlorine. Ultraviolet light is required only for the final sterilization stage. From an engineering perspective, the dunes operate as an enormous gravity-driven biological filtration system. The possible role of the bison arises from the physical condition of that filter. According to descriptions of the system, filtration performs best when the dune landscape remains open and dynamic. Dense, closed scrub does not process water in the same way as an open dune. Thick and stagnant vegetation can retain undesirable nutrients, while a heavy grass layer may hold water near the surface instead of allowing it to move freely through the sand. The same vegetation closure that damaged rare species could therefore also undermine the environmental conditions on which water filtration relies. This is where the evidence must be expressed precisely. It is firmly documented that the dunes filter drinking water for the region. It is also established that open dune habitat functions differently from terrain, dominated by thick shrubs and grass. The project and the utility support the reasonable inference that grazing animals maintaining open dunes help preserve the conditions needed for filtration. On that basis, the bison can be said to contribute indirectly to the protection of the drinking water supply. What does not exist is a controlled experiment isolating the bison's precise effect on water quality in the same way that the vegetation study isolated their effect on woody encroachment. The most accurate conclusion is therefore that the biodiversity benefit has been directly measured, while the water-related benefit is a logical consequence of the habitat structure described by those operating the filtration system, not a separately proven causal result. The historical background strengthens the credibility of the relationship. Filtering drinking water through dunes is not a recent Dutch experiment. It is a long-established practice that has been refined for more than a century as the country learned to manage the connection among its coastline, sandy landscapes, and water supply. In effect, the dunes are a form of national infrastructure made from a living ecosystem rather than concrete or steel. That is why thousands of hectares of rare habitat came to be owned by a water utility instead of a conventional conservation organization. Biodiversity was never the utility's main objective. Its priority was clean water. Viewed from that perspective, the Bison project occupies an unusual meeting point between conservation and practical infrastructure. An initiative designed to protect a disappearing habitat was conducted on land maintained for a functional public purpose. Unexpectedly, that public purpose also appeared to benefit from the ecological restoration. Neither objective had originally been designed to support the other. The relationship emerged because both depended on the same physical landscape, an open, shifting, dynamic dune. Anything preserving that condition could serve biodiversity and water filtration simultaneously. Even when described cautiously, the result is remarkable. The project began solely as an effort to conserve biodiversity. The realization that restoring the habitat might also support the drinking water system was not part of the initial plan. Both goals turned out to depend on the same environmental structure, and that alignment was recognized only after the project was underway. What can be concluded today? It is now possible to return to the original claim and clearly distinguish the conclusions supported by strong evidence from those that remain uncertain or require qualification. The following findings are well documented. 6 European bison were introduced into Kraansvlak in 2007 and 2008. They survived exposed coastal winters without supplemental feed, an outcome recorded as the first of its kind for the species. The herd increased successfully, producing 33 calves during its first decade. Its population was later maintained at approximately 22 animals, with additional bison transferred to other conservation programs. The animals created thousands of sandy wallows, stripped bark from invasive woody plants, and transported seeds throughout the reserve. An 8-year study published in a peer-reviewed journal found that the area occupied by bison resisted woody plant encroachment more effectively than comparable areas grazed by cattle or left without large grazers. These conclusions come from documented records and direct measurements rather than speculation. Other aspects remain uncertain or must be expressed more carefully. The wider argument that European bison are not genuinely forest animals receives meaningful support from Kraansvlak, but one location cannot settle a scientific debate concerning the species' ecological role across an entire continent. The return of plants such as the seaside pansy is consistent with the environmental changes caused by bison. However, dune systems are complex, so claiming that the herd alone caused the recovery would go beyond the available evidence. The connection to drinking water is plausible and is acknowledged by the utility, but it depends on the relationship between open dunes and effective filtration. It has not been established through a controlled measurement directly linking bison presence to changes in water quality. What remains is a genuinely persuasive case that does not require exaggeration. The most counterintuitive parts of the story, that an animal regarded as a forest specialist prospered on an exposed coast and helped preserve a habitat that other large grazers failed to protect, are also the parts most strongly supported by data. The most dramatic sounding claim, involving the drinking water supply, is the one that should be presented with the greatest restraint. Under that careful interpretation, the story withstands scrutiny. It seems almost unbelievable not because the evidence has been inflated, but because the result challenges an assumption that remained largely unquestioned for generations. That leads to a broader question worth considering. In conservation and in other fields, how many accepted rules continue to exist, mainly because nobody returned to examine the original conditions under which they were first observed? Views on that question are welcome in the comments. For anyone interested in seeing more stories investigated in this manner, with the evidence kept clearly separate from the narrative, subscribing to us is the best way to follow each new weekly investigation.